Hi, we're talking about Your Money Matters on NDTV Profit, and my name is Alex Matthew. You know by now that the Reserve Bank of India has cut interest rates for the last few months, and that means that all of the loans that you will take and you have taken will bear a lower interest. Now, any fresh loans, including home loans, therefore, become much more attractive. And that usually is a trigger for people who have it in the back of their minds to buy a house to contemplate doing so. The question is, should you do that right now? Or should you defer the purchase of a house? That age-old rent versus buy argument. And that's exactly what we're going to take up in the first half of Your Money Matters. And we'll also talk about everything that you need to know from a tax filing perspective, because you better get started before it gets too late. My first guest today is Sarthak Ahuja, who's an investment banker and an educator. You've probably seen some of his videos online. Sarthak, thanks so much for taking the time. This argument or this conversation circles back every time the interest rates go lower or some other trigger comes about, and I thought, why don't we take it up again? So first, let's lay it out. What are the pros and cons of buying a house? And of course, it's not necessarily something that you can paint with the same color and brush, because micro markets exist in real estate.
Yeah, well, the biggest pro would be the emotional satisfaction that one gets of having like a roof of their own, a place that they can call their own. I think the con would have to be the lack of liquidity in buying a house, because you're actually committing to an asset which could, when you look at price to income ratios in India, the average for Indian metros is 11 years, which practically means your household, not just your individual in hand income, but of your entire household, which would include maybe your partner or a sibling or a parent who's contributing to the house. Well, your in hand income for the next 11 years on an average is what is going to go into purchasing just the principal value of this house today. And when you're making such a commitment for which you will have to take a financial loan and the tenure could be about 20 years, you're really signing up for, if you want to commit to this, you may have to give up on a lot of your lifestyle aspirations, which could also include, what kind of school you would want to send your child to, or if you want to ever do a foreign holiday, because it's a huge financial commitment for a very long time. So I think it has to be a very well thought out financial decision.
So let's get into some of this. And you mentioned one of the most important pros is that emotional satisfaction, but I want to remove that from the equation, because ultimately, if you have to buy a house and that's the only thing that will give you satisfaction, then no financial argument will make sense, Sarthak. So let's remove that from the equation. And the math often does not add up in favor of buying a house, does it, Sarthak?
Well, if you talk about financially, it actually does not add up. And to give you more color to this, normally in most metro cities, you would see in the city center, the rental yields on the property or the total amount of rent that you may get as a percentage of the total value of the property. And we take annual rent for this argument. The annual rent in most cases is going to be less than 2% if you're living in the city center of a metro city in India. The further you go away from the city center, it tends to be closer to between 3 to 4%. I'd say 3% is more realistic in most markets. And when you take a house and you're actually signing up for EMIs at the current interest rates, where if you take a 20-year tenure, you may actually be paying closer to 8% of the value of the house is EMIs every year, which means the real delta or the difference between how much you would pay in rent is just 3% of the value of the house, and how much you would have to pay to buy it is 8% the value of the house. And then you commit to that payment for the next 20 years, you're kind of locked in, because if you're in a rented accommodation, as your lifestyle expands, you can also move into a better accommodation. As life brings you a new job in another city, it's easier for you to move. And I think the delta of 5%, if invested in a better financial asset, which simply put could also be a Nifty 50 mutual fund, could definitely generate a lot more return for you financially in the long term. But of course, it is such an emotional decision that people tend to forget this. And I don't want to sit on a high horse and say that people should not buy a house, when I myself like to think of real estate as a financial investment. And I think what's important to clarify here is that when you buy an apartment, it's not necessarily a real estate investment. Real estate investment as a category is more when you look at land, which is a
Oh,
limited resource, and you can purchase it basis certain facts about where the government is going to do infrastructural development over the next 10 to 15 years. And then timing the market on buying that land at the right time, betting on the fact that the government is going to come up with a big infra project, which could be a highway, which could be an airport, or they could just build better roads and infrastructure for more
why
people
do
to
you?
come and set up here.
Sorry to cut you off. Why would you say that, though, Sarthak? You would see the confusion on my face if you were sitting in studio with me, and you would have asked me what's wrong. Because I'm just wondering. A lot of people have gone out, and in the early 2000s, and even after the financial crisis, when the real estate prices crashed, a lot of people went out and bought a second home as an investment. They weren't living in it. It was an investment. So why would you say that you don't count that as an investment?
It's a lot of the information we get in the market today about real estate is actually driven by a lot of the developers trying to sell luxury housing to people, which is why you always see the word investment being used with luxury apartments. And that's something where they'll show you data to say over the past 4 years, look at markets like Gurgaon, look at markets like Bangalore, look at Noida, for example. These are certain markets, or even Hyderabad, where prices of properties have gone up drastically over the past 4 years. But the biggest mistake would be if people extrapolate that price for the future to say the same trends are going to continue for the next 10, 15 years. That may actually not happen, because from these very markets of, say, Gurgaon and Bangalore, there are places or there are apartments where prices have not risen during this time in congruence with total rise in prices in the overall market. Reason being, when you buy an apartment, that apartment building after 10, 15 years will begin to look old, and it may not anymore fit into your definition of luxury, because as you go along, today a pickleball court may be really relevant for you. Maybe 15 years from now, there's going to be something else which is the new flavor of the season that every developer would want to put as part of your clubhouse, and then you wouldn't get the same resale value for a house that you bought 15 years ago. Which is why I would say apartments are more of a lifestyle investment that
Yeah.
you have to put money in from an emotional perspective and no more.
Yeah, no, I sense the marginal on the border disdain for pickleball. I see that, Sarthak. I wonder. Anyway, but okay, the point is well made, and so therefore, let's talk about the nitty-gritties of this. Would you agree, Sarthak, that a lot of people don't contemplate the additional costs when they're buying real estate? And here I'm specifically talking about apartments, because really that is what the focus is today. They don't account for the maintenance that they would pay on so-called luxury, because it's incredibly expensive, and that pickleball court has to be maintained, and it's ultimately going to be coming out of your pocket. They don't account for interest cost when they say, hey, I bought an apartment for 1 crore or 3 crore or whatever it is right now. And trust me, when you go to Borivali, which is far on the outskirts of the city of Mumbai, you're still paying over 2 crore, 2.5 crore for a house that is not very large. And the various other costs as well, the opportunity cost, as you mentioned as well, of not investing that. So do you think that enough stamp duty, taxes, do you think that enough attention is paid to all of this?
Yeah, I'd say as a thumb rule, whenever you're buying a house, at least budget another 15% is what would go into, say, transaction expenses, stamp duties. Imagine you're paying a 1% commission, you're paying about 5% stamp duties. And I know these vary as per different states. That's 5 to 6% gone. And people tend to spend close to about 10% on a new house, because you don't want to bring in your old furniture into a new house, right? So people end up spending that much, which means 15% over the base value is what you'll end up spending, regardless of whether you're buying it upfront or you're taking on an EMI. Now, for maintenance expenses, I typically think that it's within the range of about 0.5% the value of the house is where it is okay, reasonable for the entire year for maintenance as well as utility bills that you would have to pay, which essentially you could also look at from another lens, which is whatever is the gross rental value of the house that you can aim to get in a year. Not more than 30% of it is what you should pay in maintenance expenses. And as a thumb rule, just take the fact that the income tax act gives you 30% standard deduction on your rental income, and ideally it should be no more than that.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned tax, because a lot of the benefits that you have had with the old tax regime will be thrown out of the window, because a lot of people are moving to that new tax regime, and so Section 24 is unavailable, Section 80C is unavailable, and so therefore the final conclusion to this, Sarthak, I'm not saying don't go and buy a house. Everyone should ultimately live in a house that they own, because when they stop earning an income, that outflow through rent is not something that you want to contemplate. And so I'm asking, should you be more willing to defer that purchase, to say that a large chunk of what you will pay you should have as investments that you can then convert into a physical asset? Is that a better argument to make?
Absolutely. And I leave people with some thumb rules that they can apply to their own specific case, which is when you go to buy a house, don't buy something which is more than 5 times of your household in hand income. Try and get the housing loan tenure to not be more than 20 years in duration. You should definitely have 50% the value of the house today as savings, out of which the down payment should be closer to 35%, and set aside 15% as your emergency fund. Have a medical insurance cover on your family floating, which could be upwards of 1 crore rupees in today's day and age, and have a life insurance which is at least 2 times the value of the house. Also, your EMIs should not be more than 35% of your in hand household income. I think broadly, if you can maintain this, you should be able to afford a house today. If you can't afford it in the city in which you're living, it may be better to either defer the purchase, or maybe think of evaluating if you would want to buy a house in a tier 2, tier 3 city where you can meet these financial thumb rules given your current income.
Yeah, and it's not always a bad thing, right? You may love the city that you're currently residing in, but that security ultimately is what everyone is going for. And you can look at retiring in the hills or near a beach somewhere. That's a good prospect to have, isn't it, Sarthak? Thanks so much for joining me today. Always a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Alex.
All right, so there you go. Let us know what you think. This is an age-old argument and it's not going anywhere.